Okay, so I'm a storyteller, and so I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a bit of a career story. And this talk comes partly from a lecture that I gave at a Busick symposium last year, and I talked a bit about how I got into meteorites. So I didn't study meteoritics as a graduate student, but I got into it later. So here's what. Let me go ahead and there we go. So after my PhD, I went to Bayreuth in Germany and I set up a TEM lab there. And we did lots of experiments and I characterized the high pressure minerals we produced and especially studied the phase transitions, how olivine goes to its high pressure polymorphs, pyroxene goes to garnet and so on. And so I'd become very familiar with these high pressure minerals. And in about 1995, a guy named Ahmed El-Gharezi came to Bayreuth and gave a talk about shocked meteorites. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever met Ahmed El-Gharezi. He gives these incredible talks with too many slides and sort of a bombastic approach, and I couldn't believe what he was saying, and I certainly didn't want to work with him. But they talked me into working with him, and he sent his postdoc Chen Ming over to do some TEM. So they've been looking at shocked meteorites and shock melt veins in meteorites, and there are little garnets in these veins. And they wanted me to help them characterize the garnets. So we prepared some samples, and the first look at them, and you can see on the upper right, this is a TEM image of the part of the melt vein that quenched. And there's a nice, almost euhedral garnet in the center, a majorite garnet. And around it is another phase, which is magnesiowostite. So I'm working with Mr. Chen. I say, all right, there's your garnet. What's this other phase? And he says, I don't know. Well, let's figure it out. So we figured out what was all in this, what quenched from this melt. And around the same time, Carl Agee published an extensive experimental study on trying to understand the crystallization of the mantle, where he took Allende and did high pressure melting experiments and created this phase diagram. And if you look at the phase diagram, and I've circled it in blue, that's the region where majorite plus magnesiowostite forms. And okay, so, oh my God, we have a pressure. We have a crystallization pressure. I communicated this to Ahmed El-Gharezi and he went nuts. And the reason he went nuts is because his scientific nemesis, Dieter Stoeffler, had basically told the world that you need on the order of 75 to 90 gigapascals to produce this sort of thing. And here we have evidence that it actually forms around 25. So less than half the minimum pressure that the community had been using as sort of the pressure for this sort of thing. That's what got me started in this. And it was quite a great start. It's interesting too, because when we presented these results, it resulted in the most intense, heated debates in a meeting I've ever seen. And I was in the middle of it. And so, you know, a young guy fighting all these people I don't know at planetary conferences over this result. So here's a table from Stoeffler's 1991 paper. And this is really the main sort of shock classification that people use. He's modified, he's updated it, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But I want to run through quickly what it is. He divided meteorites into these shock stages 1 through 6, looking at shock effects in olivine and plagioclase, and then this thing he calls pressure temperature excursions, local pressure temperature excursions. And then he gives a shock pressure, and these are calibrated against shock experiments. So when you do shock recovery experiments, you can figure out what pressure it took to create various things. And I'm not going to go into it, but there are some issues with shock recovery experiments that explain why these numbers aren't so good. But then he's got temperatures and so on. But what I want to get into is this is a shock vein right here. This is RC 106, Roosevelt County 106, and it's got a big fat shock vein. And this is where all the high pressure minerals live. You can think of this as a little dike, and I'll talk more about that. And these are the entrained class, entrained fragments transform to high pressure minerals. And so this is ringwoodite. If we look at his shock classification, this S6, very strongly shocked, this is where you get solid state recrystallization and formation of ringwoodite. And this is, as he mentions, restricted to local regions in or near melt zones. And he attributes this to these pressure temperature excursions. So S6 is restricted to local regions in or near the melt zones, pressure between 45 and 55, so basically between about 50 and maybe 80 GPa. They require local pressure temperature excursions that don't apply to the whole rock. Now, in a way, he's right, but not quite. If you look at a rock like this and you shock classify the rest of the rock, you typically would get S4 or S5, not S6. Okay, so here's the updated version. And I'm not going to go through this, but he modified it a little bit. But after lots of arguing about these issues and trying to explain how our lower pressure numbers fit into this, he came to this conclusion in 2017. Shock effects produced during the extended pressure release path, such as most high pressure phases, are less useful because they are not indicative of the equilibrium peak shock pressure achieved in the shocked rock. So I spent many years trying to figure out what exactly this crystallization pressure means, and does it capture the equilibrium shock pressure? And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the much of this talk. Okay, so it also turns out that these shocked meteorites are a gift from the asteroid belt. All of our natural examples of high pressure minerals that exist in the deep earth, almost all of them come from shocked meteorites. A few things have been found in diamond inclusions and so on, but all of the deep earth minerals are found in shocked meteorites. So that's the gift. They are found only associated with the melt vein. So there are two types. There's an igneous type. The shock melt itself quenches quickly and produces high pressure minerals. And also there's this contact metamorphic effect. All of the fragments that get entrained in the shock melt transform to high pressure minerals, especially around the edges. This is a picture of an embale. This is one that one of my students is currently working on. And these olivines are transformed around the edges. Here's a cartoon I made years ago explaining this contact metamorphic effect. The brown is the solidified melt, typically made up of Meteorite garnet and high pressure phases. And the blue is ringwoodite. The red in this case is what happens to the enstatite, forms a garnet structure called Meteorite. And then you get a fair amount of transformation right at the very edge of the melt vein, very much like a contact aureole. And then the mescalinite, you have mescalinites, which are a glassy plagioclase. And typically in contact with the melt vein, you have a melted plagioclase. So it's, some call it mescalinite, some don't, but it is a plage that actually got partially melted in contact with the shock vein. Here is one of my favorite samples. This is Aquifer 040. And the thing I like about this sample, it's very well prepared, very nice thin section. It is a breccia, and the shock veins in this case are the black bits. So there's a relatively large pocket of shock melt up here, some thinner veins, and a network, a lacy network of tiny veins. This turns out to be important. This is one of the most of the high pressure samples that we've found in terms of high pressure minerals. And you can see it was kind of an odd meteorite too. It's got some fragment here of some different material, but it's an L-chondrite. And let's see what's in it. This is just an optical image of one of these melt veins. Before we got into this too, most of the literature described these shock veins as glassy veins, glassy melt veins. Now, I don't know about you, but you can see in the optical microscope, they are not glassy at all. That's a crystalline product. That is the quench of that melt. And the reason that they generally are black is they have disseminated metal sulfide droplets. Ringwoodite is this common blue mineral, and the thing that's both good and bad about ringwoodite, it's very easy to observe. And so for many people, you look at the sample, you see ringwoodite, you go to Stoeffler's classification, shock stage S6, very high pressure, and you're done. But you don't, that's not really how it works. So let's look at another phase transformation. So here is here's an enstatite that's been transformed. And here is it's ringwoodite plus enstatite. And I'm going to go to an SEM, a backscatter image of that same enstatite. So what you can see here, this is surrounding is the matrix. This is the melt that crystallized. In this case, it consists of a mineral called achimotoite and ringwoodite. And then here's that enstatite, and it has this cellular structure. And you can see in backscatter images, you can see textures that indicate that the mineral has transformed. And this is a transformation texture. So we wanted to know what it was. So we took a fib section, so slice out a slice with gallium ions in the focused ion beam device, and thin it down and put it in the TEM. In the TEM, that slice looks like this. It's mostly pyroxene glass of a composition enstatite 85. And then that cell structure are other minerals. And you can see there's a granular texture, right? That the cells represent or show us some sort of granular texture in this. If we zoom in on these minerals, it's a combination of ringwoodite and stishovite. These, you can see these very angular pieces. These are the stishovites. They always have beautiful euhedral shapes in these samples. The ringwoodite commonly has this sort of contrast from stacking faults. And then here's another one, ringwoodite and magnesium-wustite. So the other common mineral in here is this oxide. It's magnesium-wustite, has the rock salt structure, but it's a mixture of magnesium and iron oxide. So in this case, the ferrocylite component of the pyroxene broke down to make this spinel. Aronzite is the iron ringwoodite, plus wustite plus stishovite. Here's a phase diagram for pure MgSiO3 from Fay and Birdka, showing the various minerals in high pressure minerals in an enstatite composition. We did some calculations with Perplex for a composition of 80% enstatite. And this shows you where that assemblage is stable. So we think that this transformation occurred around this pressure range on the order of 23 to 24 GPa. It's not a real tight constraint on pressure, but it's definitely not something, we don't think it represents the very high pressures inferred by Stoeffler and others. Okay, but this argues against extreme pressures. There are very few samples that have Bridgmanite in them. Now, in this particular sample, we didn't really find crystalline Bridgmanite, or maybe we did, but not enough to be significant. So let's look at another vein down here. This one has Bridgmanite too, vitrified Bridgmanite. So for those who don't know, Bridgmanite is the perovskite structure mineral that makes up the lower mantle. It was one that eluded us for a long time in natural samples, and we'll get into that later, why that's the case. But in 2014, my colleague Oliver Chowner discovered natural Bridgmanite in a shock meteor called Tenham, and I encouraged him to name it Bridgmanite after Percy Bridgman, who's the father of high pressure experiments, a physicist. Anyway, so that mineral is called Bridgmanite. This is this melt vein. Optically, it looks like this. It's blue and granular. And this area right here is this part of the BSE image over here. The bright stuff is a mixture of iron metal and iron sulfide, or iron nickel metal and iron sulfide. And then this is the silicate component. When we zoom in, you see it's got this granular texture. You've got these pyroxene composition grains. And in between them is ringwoodite. And I'll zoom in a little farther. And you can see these sort of roundish grains. They're they don't have much structure to them. So you might think they appear to be amorphous. Turns out they are. And then this light colored phase is ringwoodite. And then here's a different mineral right here, this guy and this guy. we took this to the synchrotron and did X-ray diffraction in the synchrotron, where you focus the beam on a small area, and this is the result. In this case, we see mostly ringwoodite in blue. Akimotoite, that's the light-colored stuff. The akimotoite are these guys. And then we have just the slightest hint of Bridgmanite. We didn't really trust this as a robust identification. Chowner had similar results from Tenham, and that's what named the most abundant mineral in the deep earth. So I have a question here. So what are the chances of finding high pressure phases in melt pockets? So they absolutely are produced in melt pockets too, but as I'll talk about later, whether they are preserved depends on quench rate, and quench rate depends on the size of the melt body. We'll get to that in a little bit. So here's ACFR04. So I've used this sort of cartoon version of AG's phase diagram over and over again, and we superimpose conditions. So here is the Bridgmanite plus Bridgmanite plus ringwoodite stability up there. Most of the high pressure minerals we see in S6 veins in Chondrites crystallize in this range, between about 15 and maybe 25 gigapascals. But ACFR04 actually represents a higher pressure than most that we see. The Chondrite Tenham is also similar in that it represents a somewhat higher pressure. This is the kind of path, that quench path, that we think happened for this sample. And the reason that we think this is these high pressure minerals are destroyed at low pressure if they remain hot. Now we know that shock materials are hot after pressure release. There is a misconception. Some people think that materials get hotter upon release. They don't. They absolutely cool from their shock temperature. But exactly what that cooling path, that decompression path is really important for understanding the origin and preservation of these minerals. So for example, these are the temperatures at which these high pressure minerals are destroyed. Bridgmanite is destroyed above 400 degrees K. And so ACFR04 probably got down to temperatures close to 400 K. The other high pressure minerals require higher temperatures to be destroyed, and they're present in the sample. Right? So high pressure minerals break down above a temperature maybe on the order of, garnet's on the order of 1400 K. But a lot of these high pressure minerals, they have to be cooled in order to survive the post-shock pressures. So here's another sample. This is Mbale. Mbale is a fall, so it's very fresh. It's an L56. You can actually see some chondrule shapes in here, and it has a fair amount of melt veining in it, or shock veining. This is one sample that we looked at with my student Jinping Hu some time ago. This is what the melt vein looks like in transmitted light. And again, you see this granular texture. The really dark bits are the iron sulfide droplets. And then these are the entrained class that transform. The matrix crystallized in this case to a mixture of garnet, majoritic garnet, wadsleyite, and oxide. I didn't really talk about what majorite is, but majoritic garnet is a garnet that has silicon in both tetrahedral and octahedral coordination. So these garnets are supersilicic. They have extra silica that goes into that octahedral coordination, and that only happens at very high pressures. The other thing about majoritic garnets is chemically, they're quite flexible. They can accommodate a lot of elements from this melt. So they're kind of interesting high pressure minerals. Here's how we know what they are. This is TEM of these things. Here is on A, majoritic garnet, and then wadsleyite, one of the polymorphs of olivine, and then these oxides, in this case, mixtures of magnesiolistite and magnetite. It turns out that the high pressure oxide is rich in ferric iron, and on decompression, it exsolves out a magnetite component. And so we see this sort of interesting salt and pepper contrast in them because of the slight exsolution of magnetite. So this is what crystallized from the melt in Mbale. This is what one of the entrained class of olivine looks like. It's got a weird mixed contrast. This is a really big one. X-ray diffraction of the synchrotron, this gave us that it's primarily polycrystalline olivine, so very fine-grained olivine. The thing that drives the transformation of a single crystal to billions of tiny crystals is the transformation to high pressure phases and then back again. So this is one that went to high pressure phases and then transformed back to olivine. But you can see it's got variations in composition that we see in the backscatter contrast. So we have phaolite-rich components and phaolite-poor components. This also is an indication that during the transformation to a high pressure polymorphs that we actually had diffusion controlled transformations where we're segregating iron in the process. This is a little surprising considering the time scale of shock and that this happened on the order of 500 to 1,000 milliseconds that this transformation happened. But the key to that is these are very high temperature processes in order to form these reactions on a time scale of seconds. Raman shows us it's also got wadsleyite, ringwoodite, and olivine. So here's that phase diagram again, and these are a number of samples that we've looked at, or that my student Jinping looked at, or both of us did. And it just shows the range of pressure temperature conditions for the high pressure minerals. And the thing is that, yes, there's a spread from 15 to nearly 30 GPa, but all these things have a fairly narrow pressure temperature range, right? They represent very high temperatures. And you look at the liquidus temperatures at 25 GPa, we're talking about 2000 degrees C. So these are high temperature features. If these represent decompression, in other words, as Stoeffler says, that they represent the decompression path and therefore they're not very useful, it begs the question, what sort of decompression path can explain this? How do you actually get these conditions during shock? And so this led us to do some calculations and so on to try to put some constraints on this. So for many years, I've been drawing these sorts of cartoons on the whiteboard explaining what's going on. And the paths are like this. So here's Mbale. Mbale did not go to nearly as high a pressure as Akfaro. And it was quite a bit hotter afterwards because of the breakdown of ringwoodite. And so we have paths like this. But the thing is that the paths are controlled by a combination of factors. The first is decompression, but also it's heat transfer from the melt vein to the surrounding rock. So my analogy that these things are little dikes is really important because they're actually quenched by unloading their heat to the surrounding host rock. To put some constraints on this, Jinping did some calculations. So he finished and went to Caltech, and he did some calculations of shock temperatures and release paths. And he used both a Birch-Moynihan-Gruneisen equation of state and an integral approximation to calculate basically pressure temperature conditions, or Hugoniot, for 4 different materials. The first is the Kinosaki basalt. The second was Murchison CM chondrite, the Bruderheim L6 chondrite, and San Marcos gabbro. These are his results. And there are a couple things that are interesting here. So again, I'm showing the liquidus and solidus curves for Allende in the gray, and then the dashed ones is for more basalt. And these are the conditions. Well, let's do the CM chondrite first. The CM chondrite has a high porosity, and porosity generates heat during shock. It's probably the biggest controlling factor in producing melt pockets and melt veins is the collapse of pores and fractures. And so this with a high porosity gets very hot and is completely melted by 45 gigapascals, right? But if you look at the other samples, Bruderheim L6 and the basalt and the gabbro, they remain about 1300 degrees below the liquidus, up to 50 GPa. And so this idea that I mean, the shock does not melt the whole sample until you get to very high pressures. At higher pressures, this will go up and intersect the melting curve. But what it's telling you is that in this range of pressures that we're interested in, the temperature of the bulk rock is much colder than the local melting. The local melting results from these local excursions, collapse of pores, collapse of fractures, and frictional melting. And so we have local hotspots in a matrix of relatively cool material. So the next thing he did was to calculate release paths. What would be the release path for a bulk sample shocked to 25 GPa? And the release path is concave downward like this, but this is the release path for 25, for 40, and for 50 GPa. So this gives us some constraints on what our quench paths can be. He also did release paths for liquids. If we had a liquid, a total liquid at 50 GPa up here starting at about 3200, this would be the path. You can see that the liquid release paths are very similar in slope to the melting curve. You can melt material on decompression. Definitely if you're crossing the melting curve on decompression, you can melt. Again, many people seem to think that the shocked material is hotter after release than at pressure, and it's not. It cools during release. It is much hotter after release than it was initially, though. But here's the thing, this gives us boundary conditions for interpreting the quench path of our shock veins. Here's just an example for a basaltic composition, so we can use this to interpret Martian meteorites, and you get very similar results, right? So here's the final sort of very busy figure from this study with Hu and Sharp. And I'll walk you through the parts that are important here, and we won't have to deal with everything here. The first thing is that the crystallization anchors the pressure temperature path, right? If I can constrain the crystallization pressure, it means that that part of the rock had to pass through those conditions. Now, exactly how it passed through, that's what we want to find out. Transformation to form high pressure minerals only occurs at very high temperatures. The kinetics for the transformation means that you need temperatures on the order of 1900 K sort of range in order to transform on the time scale of a second or half a second. So the transformations occur on materials that are very close to the melting temperature, right? The next thing is, in order to preserve the high pressure minerals, I have to end out below this gray field. This is the field where the high pressure minerals are destroyed. Garnet is the most robust, then ringwoodite, then ilmenite, and then Bridgmanite is way down below. Whatever my path is, it has to bring me down here in the end, right? And that is why we think that these are concave upward. And basically what is happening is, let me see. So we have to get down here. I have this very hot melt in contact with a cool host, and the path is dominated by conduction of heat to the surrounding, right? And that dumps the heat out, drops the temperature, and then pressure release takes us down here. The exact path that we get depends on how much melt you have, where you are within the melt. The edge of the melt quench is much faster than the center, and so on. So we have actually an array of paths for a given sample. But what happens is these all bring us down in below here. So it's a system that's dominated by the quench, produced by being in contact with a relatively cool host. This also gives us pressure constraints. So if I shock up to 40 or 50 gigapascals, if I'm up in this range, The minimum temperatures I can get are given by these release paths. So I can't really get under this gray box if I'm shocked to 40 or 50 GPa, right? So if I go from 50 and I take a path something like this, I'm going to end out being in very relatively hot post-shock temperature. The other thing is, if this were the case, the mineralogy of what I produce would be predominantly Bridgmanite, and all of that would be destroyed. And so what we see is that we don't have samples. The samples that have been shocked to very high pressures are probably impact melt breccias that are dominated by low pressure minerals and quench of shock melt after pressure release. But this really shows that we can't really get the high pressure minerals we see from a decompression path. So here's another factor that is important in this, and that is that the pressure equilibration is very, very fast. So we know, we've done a lot of thermal modeling of how these little veins must quench, and they're fairly simple thermal models, but that's how we get this estimate of timing of on the order of hundreds of milliseconds to thousands to 1,000 or so milliseconds. What is the time scale over which the pressure equilibrates? Well, this is a figure from a paper by Julia Moreau. And what she did was she did mesoscale modeling of shock effects in materials to try to explain local variations in shock pressure and temperature. And I'm just going to show this because it's really interesting. This is a simple model. It's troilite on the top, and then I've got this curved interface, and then I have iron, and then olivine. And here comes the shock wave. And you can see here's the shock front, and this is showing us pressure. So behind the shock front, we've got a pressure on the order of 50 gigapascal. And in front, it's higher. It's maybe 90, 80 or 90. When we hit this interface, it focuses the shock toward the center and produces a spike, a high pressure, high temperature spike. As it passes through and it gets to this other interface, it produces a second spike. And this passes through. And all of this is really important. It generates local pressure temperature excursions, just as Stoeffler had talked about. But what I want to point out is the time. This time is basically 41 nanoseconds, and this is 51 nanoseconds. This entire thing equilibrated in 10 nanoseconds. So the time scale of pressure equilibration is on the order of tens of nanoseconds. The time scale of the thermal equilibration is on the time scale of hundreds of milliseconds. And so we create these things, we create local hot zones, the pressure equilibrates very quickly, and then we quench on a larger time scale to produce what we see. So the local PT excursions happen, but they ring down in 10 to 20 nanoseconds. But here's one possibility. Let's say we produce a local melt at very high pressure. One possibility is we have a path like this. We have very rapid decompression as we equilibrate. And basically we get down to the equilibrium shock pressure here, and then we have a similar path to what we've talked about. So yes, you could have decompression bring us to this if this is the equilibrium shock pressure, right? So in a sense, Stoeffler is partially right. When we wrote this paper, it got kicked back by the reviewers. And they said, you have to write that Stoeffler was wrong. And so we had to revise the paper and add a significant discussion to get into the details of this. This is also supported by work of Adi Bischoff. He had a student look at, I think, like 1,000 different samples and shock classify just hundreds of samples. And what they found is that even in the most highly shocked samples, when you get away from the melt vein, the shock stage is S4, even in Tenham. Well, our equilibrium shock pressure range here fits right into their S4, into the S4 category. So we really think that these S6, these shock vein things, really represent S4, and it's consistent with what the rocks look like if you get away from the melt veins. So the melt veins, I think, are actually very useful, and they're consistent with what you get from looking at other shock effects in the rock. All right, I'm going to skip the conclusions and move on, because I want to tell you about this too. So I've also been working on Argon-Argon dating of shocked rocks. And the reason for this is that the impact history of the solar system is preserved both in the shock effects and in the dates. I'm going to answer John Fink's question. Can these be replicated in impact cratering experiments? Yes and no. The majority of impact experiments that are done, these shock recovery experiments, you put the sample into a stainless steel container and you shock it and you recover it. It's a great way to shock a material and recover it, but what it does is it gives you high pressure by shock reverberation. The shock wave goes through the sample back and forth and gradually increases the pressure, and this gives you a much cooler sample than if you do it in a single shock, like in a natural shock. One of the main reasons why these shock effects that have high activation energies, like phase transitions, one reason we don't see them in shock experiments is they simply don't get enough energy in shock recovery experiments. If you do an experiment that's not shock recovery, then you can sweep up very fine dust from the bottom of the chamber and analyze it, and very few people do it that way. But there have been some recent new experiments where you do kind of a miniature crater experiment and you model the pressure using ISAIL. And in that case, you've actually produced shock veins and high pressure minerals locally in a sample in a single shock miniature cratering experiment. It's kind of a special experiment. The first I saw of it was 2 years ago at LPSC. But that's the first example of producing these things in a shock experiment. Before that, there weren't any. Okay, so the history of impacts is recorded in Argon-Argon dating, and there are a number of groups that have done this. Tim Swindle at U of A has done a lot of this, also with David Kring and Barbara Cohen and so on. And this is a plot from a review paper by Swindle et al. And what it's showing is the age distribution for Chondrites. And Chondrites, some of them are about the age of the solar system, and most of them have a shock age of about 500 million years. And that turns out to be interesting for a couple of reasons. One, nearly all of the samples that not all the samples, but many of the samples that I've studied are Chondrites. And so I spent all this time studying the same impact event. And it took a little while for me to figure that out. We have also studied eucrites and Martian samples and so on too. So we do study other impacted meteorites. But a lot of us have spent a lot of time on Chondrites, and it represents a big impact event at 470 million years ago. So Argon-Argon dating, I don't know how familiar you are with it. It's a form of potassium-argon dating, where potassium-40 decays to calcium-40 and argon-40. And in potassium-argon, you measure both the potassium-40 and the argon-40 to get an age. But it's easier if you do this. You irradiate this sample with neutrons. That'll transform the calcium-40 to argon-37, and it transforms potassium-39 into argon-39. And then you measure the ratio of argon-40 to argon-39. It's a relative dating technique because the effect of the irradiation has to be considered, and we do that by co-irradiating a sample of known age and using that to calibrate the ages. So here at ASU, Kip Hodges' lab, they're experts in this, and we've teamed up with them to do Argon-Argon dating on a number of Chondrites and other samples, but mostly Chondrites of various ages. So I want to talk about that. It turns out that Chondrite parent body breakup at 470, it's a really interesting event because it resulted in a shower of meteorites in the Ordovician. And there's a guy in Sweden, Schmitz, who has spent his career basically sampling these fossilized meteorites and demonstrating that this event at 470 showered the Earth with chondrite material. We see it in the Argon-Argon dating. So the main way that people do Argon-Argon dating is step heating. And in step heating, you take a piece of sample, you heat it, and run the gases in a mass spec and measure your argon isotopes. And you do incremental heating. You gradually do this step heating and measure as you go. If you get a plateau in age as you heat, that plateau then gives you an age. And so Korochentseva et al., they worked on some correction techniques to account for excess argon and really got some very nice results for a variety of chondrites. And you can really see very clear plateaus. This one is Gubara here, and then this is another one, Parambia and Mbale, and I'm going to talk about Mbale. And they all have very well-defined impact ages of around 470 million years. I mean, really nice plateaus. You'll notice something else, though. There is a older age at high temperature release. At the end of the release, we're getting some older ages, and I'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so we were interested in how shock resets the argon ages. We know the shock effects include deformation, both plastic and brittle, heating of the bulk rock, local shock melting, and formation of high pressure minerals. Clearly, the ages are reset by loss of radiogenic argon, and it's mostly from heating above a closure temperature for these various minerals. Fracturing also enhances the loss. And the main potassium-bearing mineral in these rocks is the plagioclase. So it's really the shock effects of plagioclase that determines the resetting. But we wanted to know how specific shock effects result in argon loss, and what is the role of shock veins. And so we actually we looked at Mbale. Again, I'll come back to this L5, L6 chondrite. It's highly shocked. We studied it a little bit earlier. It has distinct high temperature. It has a distinct high temperature release, as we see from this the data we just showed, as well as this late release. We know the shock veins have high pressure minerals. We just sort of showed that. So at ASU, what we did is we used their laser system in Hodge's lab, and this is a UV laser. So the technique is called UV lamp, for UV laser ablation microprobe. And so my colleagues took a sample of this and put it in the UV lamp, and this is what they got. They did 3 transects across a big melt vein. And what you see, so they're 1, 2, and 3. And let's focus on 1 first. Out here, before you hit the melt vein, they get an age of 500 million years. The age goes up to 6 billion years in the middle of the melt vein, and then back down to 500 million as we go out. The blue one does the same thing. 500 million years up to the melt vein, then it jumps up to as high as 6 billion, and then back down. The green one's a little bit more complicated, and it's not exactly clear, but we get very old ages throughout the melt vein. We don't have it going into the matrix in this case, but we have these anomalously old ages. And Tice and Chris actually didn't show me the results for some time because they didn't know how to interpret, and they were kind of shocked at the results. But when we did look at it, it was clear to me what had happened. So this is a similar study from 1988 on Peace River, and it's an old paper and crappy graphics. But they looked at ages for Peace River of the host and the melt gave them much, much older ages. And they did a similar profile and got the same thing. Outside the melt vein, they were between 500 million years and 1 billion. In the center of the melt vein, they got as high as 7 billion. So this is an artifact. This is an anomalous age that the melt veins give you. Now, we've been writing proposals to do more work on this, and one of the problems that we get is people say, yeah, we've known about this since 1988. You don't need to do any more work on it. But in this original paper, they really didn't characterize the sample very well. They do very little about what shock veins are and how they work and how they quench. And so we've been studying this to try to better understand how this works. So here's Mbale again. This is the sample that we analyzed. Actually, it's the matching slice. And it's got a big melt vein with high pressure minerals. So above is the host, and we've got a lot of mescalinite outside of the melt vein in the host. And then down here is the melt vein with fine grain matrix, and then it's got coarser minerals. So for example, these are the olivines. They have olivine cores and wadsleyite rims. And you can see the wadsleyite is richer in iron. So this is actually a reaction that involved exchange of iron and magnesium. We see very fine-grained dendritic quench at the edge of the vein, getting coarser toward the middle, and so on. And then this is what the melt vein assemblage is. It's matrite garnet plus wadsleyite, very similar to what we saw in the other sample of Mbale. And then these are just the Raman spectra of all the high-pressure minerals, demonstrating that we properly identified them. This is a potassium map. This is an EDS map, potassium map. And what you see is the melt vein interior has very little potassium, and the mescalinite outside the melt vein is loaded with potassium. Here is mescalinite or plagioclase far from the melt vein. It has significant potassium too, but much less than the stuff that's neighboring the shock vein. Here is a little bit of residual not plagioclase. What was plagioclase in the melt vein is now a jadeite assemblage, and it has some potassium in it. But basically, the melt vein is virtually devoid of potassium. And we see that here in the Argon-40 versus Argon-39. So the Argon-40 is high in the melt vein. The Argon-39, the proxy for potassium, goes almost to zero in the melt vein. That's for the red track. For the blue track, similar, the Argon-39 goes way down. This is telling us that the potassium in the melt vein migrated out, but the argon did not. Okay, so clearly the behavior of potassium and argon at high pressure are quite different than what one might assume. So here's just another example of some values. You see the highest values of potassium are adjacent to the melt vein, the lowest are in the melt vein, and it tapers off as you go away from the melt vein. So it represents a migration of potassium away from the melt vein. But the question is when and how. Remember, this thing was probably at high pressure for on the order of a second. In that second, we quenched the melt vein and we drove the potassium out. And it's really odd. We migrated potassium on the scale of hundreds of microns in seconds. And we don't fully understand how this works, but we're working on it. So this had been seen before. So in 2000, Chen and El Gerazi, they measured high potassium in mescalinites, and they basically documented this process in their paper where they argued that mescalinite isn't really diaplectic glass. They used this to demonstrate, to argue that all mescalinite had melted, and this was their evidence. They didn't think about what it meant for potassium argon dates of the melt vein. Anyway, so I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna not go through all this, but basically that we have that 470 impact. The high pressure minerals require local melting. Argon is soluble in silicate melts at high pressure. There are some experimental studies that demonstrate this, but what's not clear is potassium must not be soluble in this melt. It must come out as a separate phase, a vapor phase or a liquid phase that's not compatible with the silicate melt at high pressure, and that escapes the melt vein during shock. Preservation of high pressure minerals requires rapid quench. That rapid quench traps the Argon-40 in the melt vein, but apparently not the potassium. Okay, so let's You've seen all that before. So here's what's going on. We've got this 470 million year impact. We create melt and host rock. This is how it looks on the Argon-Argon data. So at the beginning of this solar system, if we plot Argon 40 over 36 versus 39 over 36, you have this straight line. They all have the same amount of Argon 40. As the sample ages for 4 billion years, we get this, and that would be a 4 billion year old isochron. But then the impact happens 470 million years ago, and two things happen. In the melt vein, we lose the potassium, but keep the argon. Outside of the melt vein, we lose the argon, but keep the potassium, or increase the potassium. So this process is this very rapid process happening during the quench of the melt veins. And this process is the gradual loss of the argon in the post-shock heated sample. So the sample remains hot for some time. The argon is able to diffuse out of the pelagic clays and the mescalinite, and this is what we get. Now, we let it age for another 470 million years. So as we get that isochron, we let it age for another 470, and we get this. A 470 million year isochron, and this thing. Right? Now, we don't really get a great isochron, but we have some isochron data. It looks like this. Okay. This is our host. The gray band is our host, and the black line is 470. So our host is very close, slightly older than 470, just as the other data is for Mbale. This dashed line is the age of the solar system. And these are isochrons from the melt. Much of our melt seems to be older than the solar system, some of it less. And then some of those entrained clasts are in between. So the thing is, with an L chondrite, it's really clear. We know the 470 really well. If you didn't have ages older than the solar system and you just had, say, these ages and these ages, you might argue that this thing had experienced 2 impact events. But in fact, it's only 1 impact event, but this range of ages comes from this anomalous behavior of potassium at high pressure. This is a probability plot for ages from our data. This very sharp peak is the 470. That's this gray band. And then this is the rest of it. So I don't know if I want to go. I'll do this quickly. This was a study from 1997 by Kunz et al. And they interpreted that Mbale and 2 other samples had experienced 2 shock events, one at 500 million years and one at 1.8 billion years. And this is from late release, giving us a higher age, an older age. A colleague, John Wyrick, looked into this. He did his PhD with Tim Swindle, and he was really curious. Well, what is, and I should mention, up here is a plot of potassium, log of potassium over calcium. The late release phase is low in potassium relative to calcium. His question is, what is the low potassium calcium phase? I helped him with this. We tried to figure out what it is in these samples. We wrote a paper on it, but it's not in the pyroxene. There's not enough potassium. And we couldn't find any explanation in the feldspar. But I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is now. The low potassium over calcium phase is the melt vein. And the high pressure minerals such as Meteorite garnet are what have trapped the argon, but they don't have potassium in them. And so the late stage release must be from shock melt, and it doesn't represent an older impact event. It simply represents the retention of argon 40 in the high pressure minerals. This is consistent with release kinetics too. I won't get into this, but you can interpret the kinetics of argon release from your step heating data, and it looks at the low temperature release represents a low activation energy consistent with the mescalinite and pelagic clays. The high temperature release requires a much higher activation energy, probably Meteorite garnet in our shock vein. Okay, that is where I'm going to leave it. Shock veins have high pressure minerals are anomalously old, and it is really from that rapid loss of potassium. And late release ages are probably artifacts of that effect. So with that, I'll end and address some of these questions.